In April 1912, one of the most catastrophic maritime disasters in human history unfolded in the icy waters of the North Atlantic Ocean. The RMS Titanic, the largest and most luxurious passenger ship ever built, struck an iceberg on its maiden voyage and sank, taking over 1,500 souls with it. The tragedy shocked the world and became etched into our collective memory as a symbol of human hubris and the limits of technological advancement. Yet what many people don't know is that 14 years before this disaster occurred, an American author named Morgan Robertson published a novella that predicted a catastrophe with such uncanny accuracy that it continues to baffle readers and historians to this very day. This is a story of how a forgotten work of fiction foretold one of history's greatest tragedies, the life of the man who wrote it, and the extraordinary coincidences that have led many to wonder whether Robertson possessed some form of precognition or whether this was simply the most remarkable case of accidental prophecy in literary history. The book in question is titled Futility, or The Wreck of the Titan. It was published in 1898 by the small New York publishing house M.F. Mansfield. The author, Morgan Robertson, was a struggling writer who had spent years trying to make his mark in the literary world with limited success. Robertson had worked as a sailor in his youth before turning to writing, experiences that would profoundly influence his nautical fiction. The novella tells the story of a massive British ocean liner called the Titan that is described as unsinkable. The ship is the largest vessel afloat, a marvel of modern engineering that represents the pinnacle of human technological achievement. Filled with wealthy passengers and equipped with the finest luxuries money can buy, the Titan sets out on a voyage across the Atlantic Ocean. Then, on a cold April night, the supposedly unsinkable ship strikes an iceberg on the starboard side and sinks into freezing waters, killing most of its passengers due to an insufficient number of lifeboats. If this plot sounds familiar, that's because it is essentially what happened to the real Titanic 14 years later. But the similarities between Robertson's fictional Titan and the real RMS Titanic go far beyond a simple shared storyline. The parallels are so specific and so numerous that they have fueled decades of speculation about how Robertson could possibly have known what would happen. Let's examine these coincidences in detail, because the more you learn about them, the more extraordinary they become. First, consider the names of the two vessels. Robertson's fictional ship was called the Titan, while the real ship was the Titanic. These names are strikingly similar, both deriving from the Titans of Greek mythology, the powerful deities who ruled before the Olympian gods. Both names convey a sense of enormous size, power, and invincibility. This alone might be dismissed as coincidence, as any author writing about a massive ship might naturally choose a name that evokes strength and grandeur. However, the similarities are only beginning. Both ships were described as the largest vessels of their time and were called unsinkable. The real Titanic was indeed the largest ship afloat when it was launched, measuring approximately 882 feet in length. Robertson's fictional Titan was described as being 800 feet long, a remarkably close estimate. The Titanic displaced approximately 46,000 tons, while the Titan was said to displace 45,000 tons. These measurements are so similar that it seems almost impossible they could be coincidental. The technical specifications continue to align in ways that seem to defy probability. Both ships had 3 propellers. Both could reach speeds of approximately 24 to 25 knots. Both had a capacity of about 3,000 people, though neither carried enough lifeboats for all passengers and crew. This shortage of lifeboats would prove catastrophic in both the fictional and real disasters, leading to massive loss of life that could have been prevented with adequate safety equipment. The circumstances of the disasters themselves are perhaps the most chilling parallels. In Robertson's novella, the Titan strikes an iceberg on a cold April night while traveling at high speed to the North Atlantic. The ship hits the iceberg on its starboard side, tearing open the hull and causing the vessel to sink rapidly. Most passengers die in the freezing water because there aren't enough lifeboats. In reality, the Titanic struck an iceberg on the night of April 14, 1912, while traveling at near maximum speed to the North Atlantic. It too struck the iceberg on the starboard side, which opened up the hull and caused the ship to sink in less than 3 hours. And just as in the fictional account, over 1,500 people died, many because there were only enough lifeboats for about half the people on board. Even more specific details align between fiction and reality. Both ships were on their maiden voyages when they sank. Both were British vessels, though the Titanic was built in Belfast, while Robertson's Titan was simply described as British. Both ships were traveling from England toward New York when disaster struck. Both vessels sank in the month of April in the North Atlantic, where icebergs drift south in the Arctic during the spring months. The water temperature in both scenarios was near freezing, leading to rapid death by hypothermia for those passengers who ended up in the ocean. The list of similarities goes on. Both ships were considered the height of luxury, catering to wealthy passengers who expected the finest amenities. Both vessels represented the pinnacle of contemporary shipbuilding technology and were seen as symbols of human progress and industrial might. Both disasters shocked their respective societies, the fictional one in Robertson's story and the real one that occurred in 1912, because they shattered the illusion that modern technology had conquered the dangers of the sea. Now, before we delve deeper into this mystery, we need to understand who Morgan Robertson was and what might have equipped him with the knowledge or intuition to make such accurate predictions. Robertson's life story is itself fascinating and tragic, the tale of a gifted but troubled individual who never achieved the recognition he deserved during his lifetime. Morgan Andrew Robertson was born on September 30th, 1861, in Oswego, New York, a port city on Lake Ontario. His father was a ship captain, which meant that young Morgan grew up immersed in maritime culture. From an early age, he was exposed to ships, navigation, seamanship, and the stories of sailors. This upbringing would prove instrumental in shaping his future as a writer of nautical fiction. As a teenager, Robertson followed in his father's footsteps and went to sea. He spent years working aboard ships, eventually rising to the position of first mate. During this time, he gained intimate knowledge of ship design, navigation, maritime weather patterns, and the dangers faced by vessels crossing the Atlantic Ocean. However, Robertson did not remain a sailor forever. By his late 20s, he had decided to pursue a different career. He had always enjoyed writing and had a vivid imagination, so he determined to become an author. He moved to New York City and began writing stories, primarily focusing on maritime adventures and nautical themes. This made sense given his background and expertise. Robertson could write about ships and the sea with an authenticity that few other authors could match. He understood the technical details of how ships operated, the psychology of sailors, and the genuine dangers of ocean travel. Despite his knowledge and talent, Robertson struggled to achieve commercial success as a writer. He published numerous short stories and several novels throughout the 1890s and early 1900s, but none of them became bestsellers. He wrote for pulp magazines, which paid little, and he often faced financial difficulties. His work was generally well-crafted and demonstrated real knowledge of his subject matter, but it never captured the public imagination in the way he hoped. Part of the problem was that Robertson's writing style was somewhat technical and realistic, which didn't always appeal to readers who wanted more romanticized adventure stories. Robertson himself was a complex individual. Those who knew him described him as intelligent and well-read, but also moody and difficult. He struggled with alcohol throughout much of his adult life, which likely contributed to both his financial problems and his inability to build the kind of professional relationships that might have advanced his career. He was married and had a daughter, but his family life was often strained by his drinking and his inability to earn a stable income. Despite these personal struggles, Robertson continued to write prolifically, producing a steady stream of nautical fiction. It was in this context that Robertson wrote and published Futility in 1898. The novella was not particularly successful when it first appeared. It received little attention from critics and readers, selling only modestly. Robertson earned a small amount of money from it, but not nearly enough to lift him out of his financial difficulties. For 14 years, the book languished in obscurity, known only to a small number of readers who enjoyed maritime fiction. Robertson continued writing other stories and books, none of which brought him the success he craved. Then, in April 1912, everything changed. News of the Titanic disaster spread around the world, stunning people everywhere with its scale and tragedy. As details emerged about how the supposedly unsinkable ship had struck an iceberg and sunk on its maiden voyage, some readers began to remember Robertson's novella. They pulled their old copies of Futility off their shelves and were astonished to rediscover how closely the fictional Titan's fate matched that of the real Titanic. Word began to spread about this strange coincidence, and suddenly, after 14 years of obscurity, Morgan Robertson's book was back in demand. Publishers quickly recognized the commercial opportunity. A new edition of Futility was rushed into print, this time with the subtitle, or "The Wreck of the Titan," prominently displayed to emphasize the connection to the Titanic disaster. The book became a bestseller, finally bringing Robertson the financial success and recognition that had eluded him for so long. Newspapers interviewed him about the uncanny predictions in his book. People wanted to know, how had he known? Did he have some kind of prophetic vision? Was he psychic? Had he somehow foreseen the disaster? Robertson's own explanations for the similarities were surprisingly straightforward and humble. He claimed that he had not predicted anything supernatural or mysterious. Instead, he said that his predictions were based on his extensive knowledge of ships and maritime travel combined with logical extrapolation about the future of shipbuilding. Robertson explained he had simply thought carefully about what the largest possible ship that could be built with contemporary technology would look like, and then he had imagined what kind of disaster might befall such a vessel. Let's examine Robertson's reasoning, because it actually makes a great deal of sense when you understand the context of late 19th century shipbuilding. During the 1890s, there was intense competition among shipping companies to build ever larger and more luxurious ocean liners. The Atlantic passenger trade was enormously profitable, especially for ships that could cater to wealthy travelers. Companies like Cunard and White Star Line were constantly trying to outdo each other by constructing bigger, faster, and more opulent vessels. Robertson, with his maritime background, would have been well aware of these trends. Given this context, Robertson asked himself, what would be the largest ship that could reasonably be built? He considered the limitations of contemporary shipbuilding technology, the size of existing dry docks, the strength of available materials, and the practical limits of ship design. Based on his analysis, he concluded that a ship of around 800 feet in length and 45,000 tons displacement represented approximately the maximum size that was feasible. As it turned out, when the Titanic was built more than a decade later, it was indeed close to these dimensions because it represented the practical limits of what early 20th century technology could achieve. Robertson also thought about what such a massive ship would be called. He reasoned that any company building the largest ship in the world would want a name that conveyed power, size, and invincibility. Titan seemed like a logical choice, evoking the mighty giants of Greek mythology. When the White Star Line later named their ship Titanic, they were following the same logic, choosing a name that suggested enormous strength and scale. As for the disaster itself, Robertson claimed that he had simply thought about what would be the most likely catastrophe to befall a massive ship crossing the North Atlantic. Icebergs were well-known hazards in the shipping lanes, particularly in April and May when ice from the Arctic drifted southward. Any sailor who had spent time in the North Atlantic, as Robertson had, would know about this danger. Robertson asked himself, if a huge ship traveling at high speed and relying on its supposedly unsinkable construction encountered an iceberg in conditions of poor visibility, what would happen? The answer seemed obvious. The ship would strike the iceberg, probably on the starboard side, given the typical maneuvering patterns of ships, and it would sink. The shortage of lifeboats in Robertson's fictional scenario also came from his knowledge of actual maritime practices. In the 1890s, ships routinely carried far fewer lifeboats than would be needed to evacuate all passengers and crew in an emergency. This was partly due to outdated regulations that had not kept pace with the increasing size of ships, and partly due to a widespread belief that modern ships were so well built that they would never sink quickly enough to prevent rescue by other vessels. Robertson, being a practical seaman, recognized that this was dangerously complacent, and he incorporated this realistic detail into his story. So according to Robertson himself, there was no mystical foresight involved in writing Futility. He had simply used his extensive maritime knowledge and experience to make educated guesses about future developments in shipbuilding and to imagine a realistic disaster scenario. The fact that reality matches fiction so closely was, in his view, because he understood ships and the sea well enough to predict logically what would happen. This explanation is certainly plausible and demonstrates Robertson's expertise and intelligence. However, it doesn't fully satisfy everyone who has examined the coincidences. The level of specific detail that matches between fiction and reality seems to go beyond what could reasonably be expected from educated guessing alone. Consider, for instance, that Robertson got not just a general concept right, but also the specific month of April, the specific location in the North Atlantic, the 3 propellers, the similar speeds, and the near-identical dimensions. Each individual coincidence might be explainable, but the cumulative weight of all these matching details together strikes many observers as extraordinary. Some people have suggested alternative explanations for Robertson's apparent prescience. One theory is that Robertson might have had access to preliminary plans or discussions about ships that were being designed by naval architects of his era. The late 19th century saw considerable published discussion in technical journals and newspapers about the future of ship design. It's possible that Robertson, as someone interested in maritime matters, might have read articles or heard discussions about proposed ships that influenced his fictional Titan. However, there's no documentary evidence that Robertson consulted such sources, and he himself never claimed to have done so. Another theory suggests that Robertson's subconscious mind might have synthesized various pieces of information he had encountered throughout his life as a sailor and writer, combining them in ways that his conscious mind wasn't fully aware of. According to this theory, Robertson's brain essentially performed a complex calculation using data he had absorbed over years of maritime experience, arriving at remarkably accurate predictions without him consciously realizing how or why. This idea draws on psychological concepts about intuition and the power of the subconscious mind. While intriguing, it remains speculative and impossible to prove. A third perspective is simply that Robertson got remarkably lucky. According to this view, if you have enough people making enough predictions about enough different scenarios, eventually someone will make predictions that turn out to be startlingly accurate purely by chance. Robertson happened to be that person. The tens of thousands of books published in the decades before the Titanic disaster almost certainly contained many different imagined ship disasters, and Robertson's just happened to match reality more closely than the others. This statistical argument has some merit, though it perhaps underestimates just how many specific details align between Futility and the real disaster. What makes the story even more intriguing is what happened after the Titanic disaster. Following the renewed publication of Futility and the attention it received, Robertson made some revisions to the text. In subsequent editions, he added even more details that matched the Titanic disaster, though he was criticized by some for trying to capitalize on tragedy by making his fictional account more similar to real events after fact. However, it's important to note that the core elements of the story, including the most striking similarities, were present in the original 1898 edition, before anyone could have known about the Titanic. The success of the republished Futility brought Robertson belated recognition, but it didn't fundamentally change his life. He continued to write, producing more nautical fiction and other stories, but he never wrote another book that achieved the same level of fame. His personal struggles with alcohol continued, and his financial situation remained precarious despite the Futility windfall. Robertson's later years were marked by declining health and ongoing difficulties maintaining relationships with publishers and editors. Morgan Robertson died on March 24, 1915, in Atlantic City, New Jersey. He was only 53 years old. The cause of death was listed as heart disease, though his years of heavy drinking had undoubtedly taken a toll on his health. His death received little attention in the press, and he was quickly forgotten by the general public. The irony is profound. Robertson had finally achieved fame with Futility, but that fame was based entirely on a supposed prediction that he claimed was just informed speculation. His other writings, which he might have considered more important or artistic, were largely ignored then and remain obscure today. Robertson's story raises interesting questions about the nature of prediction, expertise, and coincidence. On one hand, his explanations for how he wrote Futility make logical sense. He was a knowledgeable maritime professional who understood ships and made educated guesses about future developments. On the other hand, the sheer number and specificity of the matching details between his fiction and reality seemed to exceed what pure logic and expertise would produce. This has led some people to wonder if there might be something more mysterious at work. Throughout history, There have been other examples of fiction that seem to predict future disasters or events. Perhaps the most famous beyond Robertson's work is the case of Edgar Allan Poe's novel The Narrative of Arthur Gordon Pym of Nantucket, published in 1838. In that story, survivors of a shipwreck resort to cannibalism, drawing lots to determine who will be eaten. The victim is a character named Richard Parker. 46 years later, in 1884, the yacht Mignonette sank in the South Atlantic, and survivors did indeed resort to cannibalism. The victim was a young cabin boy named Richard Parker. This coincidence is even more specific than Robertson's Titanic prediction in some ways, involving not just circumstances but an exact name. Are such cases evidence of precognition or psychic abilities? Most scientists and skeptics would say no. They would argue that with millions of books published throughout history, some are bound by pure chance to resemble future events. The ones that match get remembered and discussed, while the vast majority that don't match are forgotten. This is sometimes called the Texas sharpshooter fallacy, referring to a joke about someone who shoots at a barn and then paints a target around wherever the bullet holes landed, making it look like they're an excellent shot. In this analogy, we're painting targets around the few predictions that happen to come true while ignoring all the ones that didn't. However, others argue that the human mind might have capabilities we don't fully understand. Perhaps experienced experts in the field can develop intuitions that allow them to predict future developments with uncanny accuracy, even if they can't fully explain how they know what they know. Robertson's maritime expertise might have given him insights that went beyond conscious reasoning. His years at sea might have taught him to recognize patterns and understand ship design and maritime hazards in ways that allowed his subconscious mind to extrapolate future scenarios with remarkable precision. There's also the question of whether Robertson himself believed he had predicted the Titanic disaster in any meaningful way. Based on his public statements, he seems to have been genuinely surprised by how closely reality matched his fiction. He consistently attributed the similarities to his maritime knowledge rather than to any mystical or prophetic ability. This suggests that whatever process led him to write Futility with such accurate details, it wasn't something he was consciously aware of or could fully explain even to himself. The impact of the Titanic disaster on maritime safety regulations cannot be overstated. The tragedy shocked the world and led to immediate reforms. The International Convention for the Safety of Life at Sea was convened in 1914, resulting in new regulations that required ships to carry enough lifeboats for all passengers and crew, maintain 24-hour radio watches, and establish clearer procedures for ice warnings. The United States also established the International Ice Patrol, which monitors iceberg dangers in the North Atlantic and issues warnings to ships. These reforms have saved countless lives in the century since the Titanic sank. In a strange way, Robertson's fictional disaster in Futility prefigured not just a real disaster, but also some of the lessons that needed to be learned. His novella highlighted the dangers of complacency about maritime safety, the inadequacy of lifeboat provisions, and the risks of traveling at high speed through ice fields. If more people in the shipping industry had read and heeded the warnings implicit in Robertson's fiction, perhaps the real Titanic disaster might have been prevented. This raises an interesting philosophical question. Can fiction serve as a useful tool for predicting and potentially preventing disasters by forcing us to imagine what could go wrong? Science fiction writers have long claimed that one of the functions of their genre is to help society think through the implications of technological development before problems arise. Stories about robots, artificial intelligence, genetic engineering, space exploration, and other technologies allow us to explore ethical and practical issues in a safe, fictional context before we face them in reality. Perhaps Robertson's Futility, even though it was not marketed as science fiction, performed a similar function for maritime safety, even if that function only became apparent after the disaster it seemed to predict had already occurred. The story of Futility in the Titanic has entered popular culture as one of the most famous cases of apparent precognition or coincidence in history. It's frequently cited in books and articles about strange coincidences, predictions, and the paranormal. The case has been featured in numerous television documentaries about mysteries and unexplained phenomena. It remains a topic of fascination because it touches on deep questions about whether the future can be known, whether some people have special abilities to foresee coming events, and whether coincidences can be so extraordinary that they suggest something beyond mere chance at work. From a skeptical perspective, Robertson's apparent prediction is likely the result of several factors working together. His maritime expertise allowed him to make educated guesses about ship design and maritime hazards. The late 19th century was a time when it was becoming increasingly obvious that ships were getting bigger and that this trend would continue. The dangers of icebergs in the North Atlantic were well known to anyone familiar with maritime travel. The shortage of lifeboats on ships was a documented reality of the time. Put all these elements together, and Robertson was essentially describing not a wildly speculative future, but rather an extrapolation of current trends and existing hazards. Moreover, the story of the Titan and the Titanic has likely been embellished and exaggerated over time. As the tale has been retold over the decades, people may have emphasized the similarities while downplaying or forgetting the differences. For instance, while the two ships were similar in size, they were not identical. The Titan in Robertson's story was described as having a different interior layout than the real Titanic. The specific circumstances of how the ships struck their respective icebergs differed in some details. The number of passengers and crew was not exactly the same. These differences tend to get overlooked in retellings that emphasize the dramatic similarities. Additionally, it's worth noting that after the Titanic disaster, Robertson did revise his novella for republication, and some of the details became more similar to the real disaster in these later editions. While the core story remained the same, Robertson added or modified some elements to bring his fiction more in line with reality. Critics have pointed out that this makes it somewhat difficult to be entirely certain which similarities existed in the original 1898 edition and which were added later. However, contemporary accounts from 1912 confirm that even the original edition contained most of the striking parallels. Despite these skeptical considerations, the case of Futility and the Titanic remains remarkable. Even if we accept that Robertson's predictions were based entirely on knowledge and logical thinking rather than anything supernatural, the fact that so many specific details aligned is still impressive. It demonstrates the power of expertise and careful reasoning to anticipate future developments. Robertson may not have been psychic, but he was clearly a thoughtful and knowledgeable writer who understood his subject matter deeply. The philosophical implications of the Futility case extend beyond questions of prediction and coincidence. The story also raises issues about the nature of tragedy and whether disasters are in some sense inevitable. Both Robertson's fictional Titan and the real Titanic sank because of a combination of human arrogance, overconfidence in technology, inadequate safety measures, and bad luck. These factors were present in the maritime industry of the late 19th and early 20th centuries in ways that made a disaster almost bound to happen eventually. Robertson may have predicted the Titanic not because he could see the future, but because he understood the present so well that he could see the disaster waiting to happen. This is perhaps the most important lesson from the story of Futility and the Titanic. Experts who deeply understand a system or industry can often see risks and potential disasters that others miss. Robertson, with his years of experience at sea and his technical knowledge of ships, could see that the combination of increasingly large vessels, inadequate safety regulations, overconfidence about unsinkability, and the natural hazards of the North Atlantic was a recipe for catastrophe. The tragedy is that he was writing fiction, which most people didn't take seriously as a warning, and that even after his book was published, the maritime industry continued on its dangerous course until the Titanic disaster forced change. In the decades since the Titanic sank, numerous other authors, filmmakers, and artists have told stories about the disaster. The Titanic has become one of the most famous ships in history, despite or perhaps because of its tragic fate. James Cameron's 1997 film Titanic became one of the highest-grossing movies of all time, introducing the story to new generations. Books, documentaries, and exhibitions continue to explore every aspect of the disaster. The wreck of the ship itself, discovered on the ocean floor in 1985, has been extensively photographed and studied. Yet amidst all this attention, Morgan Robertson's Futility remains a unique part of the Titanic story, the book that predicted the disaster before it happened. For those interested in the paranormal or unexplained phenomena, Robertson's apparent prediction remains a tantalizing mystery. How could one man get so many details right? Was there really nothing more than educated guessing involved? These questions likely can never be answered definitively, and that uncertainty is part of what makes the story endure. We want to believe that some people might have special insights or abilities that allow them to glimpse the future. Robertson's story offers a possible example, while remaining ambiguous enough to allow for multiple interpretations. For skeptics and scientists, the Robertson case serves as a useful reminder about the importance of critical thinking and statistical reasoning. When evaluating apparent predictions, we need to consider how many predictions were made that turn out to be wrong, not just a few that happen to be right. We need to look carefully at whether similarities are being exaggerated or differences minimized. And we need to consider whether expertise and logic might explain apparent precognition without resort to supernatural explanations. The Robertson case can be used to teach these important analytical skills. But perhaps the most enduring value of the Futility story is simply as a remarkable historical footnote, a strange and compelling coincidence that adds another layer of meaning to the Titanic disaster. The fact that a struggling writer predicted in fiction what would later happen in reality gives the Titanic tragedy an almost mythical quality, as if fate or destiny were at work. Whether or not you believe there was anything supernatural about Robertson's prediction, you have to admit that the parallels are extraordinary and that the story of how a book predicted a disaster 14 years before it happened is inherently fascinating. Morgan Robertson deserves to be remembered not just for his apparent prediction, but as a talented writer who never achieved the recognition he deserved in his lifetime. His nautical fiction was well-crafted and authentic, drawing on real experience and knowledge. The fact that Futility became famous only because of its coincidental resemblance to a real disaster is somewhat unfortunate, as it means Robertson's other works were overshadowed and forgotten. Yet perhaps there is some justice in the fact that Futility brought him belated success, even if that success was based on something he claimed was nothing more than logical extrapolation from his maritime expertise. The Titanic disaster itself taught the world important lessons about the dangers of hubris and overconfidence. The ship was called unsinkable, and this led to a dangerous complacency about safety. When the disaster occurred, it shattered illusions about humanity's ability to conquer nature through technology. These lessons remain relevant today as we continue to push the boundaries of what technology can achieve. We still build enormous structures, whether ships, airplanes, buildings, or computer systems, and we still sometimes assume that our modern engineering is so sophisticated that nothing can go wrong. The Titanic reminds us that this assumption is dangerous. Robertson's Futility carries a similar message in its title. The word futility suggests that human efforts are ultimately futile, that despite our best intentions and greatest achievements, we remain vulnerable to disaster and tragedy. Both the fictional Titan and the real Titanic were monuments of human achievement, the largest ships of their respective worlds, equipped with the finest technology available. Yet both were destroyed by a piece of ice, a simple force of nature that human technology could not overcome. This is a humbling reminder that no matter how advanced we become, we cannot completely control or predict everything that might happen. In examining the story of how Morgan Robertson predicted the Titanic disaster 14 years before it happened, we've explored questions of expertise and intuition, coincidence and fate, tragedy and hubris. We've considered whether Robertson had some form of prescience or whether he was simply a knowledgeable professional who made educated guesses that happened to prove remarkably accurate. We've looked at his life story and seen how a talented but struggling writer finally achieved success, though only because of a catastrophic disaster that he apparently predicted in fiction. The truth is that we may never know for certain exactly how Robertson achieved such accuracy in his predictions. Perhaps it was pure expertise and logic. Perhaps there was an element of intuition or subconscious synthesis of information that even Robertson himself didn't fully understand. Perhaps it was simply extraordinary luck, a coincidence so remarkable that it seems to demand a more mysterious explanation even if none exists. Each reader and each interpreter of this story must decide for themselves which explanation seems most plausible. What we can say with certainty is that the story of Futility in the Titanic is one of the most extraordinary cases of apparent prediction in literary history. The parallels between Robertson's fiction and the subsequent reality are detailed enough and numerous enough that they continue to fascinate people more than a century after the real disaster occurred. Whether you approach the story as a skeptic looking for rational explanations or as someone open to more mysterious possibilities, you cannot help but be struck by the uncanny similarities between what Robertson imagined and what actually happened. The legacy of both Futility and the Titanic disaster continues to resonate today. The Titanic remains a symbol of human tragedy and the limits of technology. Futility remains a curiosity, a book that achieved fame not for its literary merits, but for its apparent ability to see into the future. Together, they remind us that reality can sometimes be stranger than fiction, that expertise and knowledge are valuable tools for anticipating future developments, and that we should always remain humble about our ability to control or predict everything that might happen in our world. Morgan Robertson died in 1915, just 3 years after the Titanic disaster and the renewed publication of his most famous work. He died without knowing that his book would be remembered and discussed for more than a century after his death. He died still struggling with personal demons and financial difficulties, never having achieved lasting success as a writer beyond the one novella that became famous for reasons he never fully intended. In some ways, his story is as tragic as the story of the Titanic itself, a tale of potential unfulfilled and recognition that came too late to make a real difference in his life. Yet Robertson's prediction, if we can call it that, ensures that his name will not be completely forgotten. As long as people continue to be fascinated by the Titanic disaster, they will also be interested in the man who seemed to predict it 14 years before it happened. As long as we wonder about whether the future can be known or whether some coincidences are too extraordinary to be mere chance, we will continue to discuss futility and debate what it means. And as long as we value expertise and the ability to think logically about future possibilities, we will appreciate what Robertson achieved, whether through prophetic vision, intuitive genius, or simply careful reasoning combined with deep knowledge of his subject. The story of how a book predicted the Titanic disaster 14 years before it happened is ultimately a story about the power of the human mind, the mysteries of coincidence, and the enduring fascination of one of history's greatest tragedies. It's a story that combines maritime history, literary curiosity, and philosophical questions about prediction and fate. It's a story that has captured imaginations for over a century and will likely continue to do so for many years to come. What do you think about Morgan Robertson's prediction of the Titanic disaster? Was it simply a case of expert knowledge and logical reasoning allowing him to anticipate future developments? Or was there something more mysterious at work, some form of intuition or precognition that science cannot yet explain? Could the striking similarities between futility and the real Titanic disaster be nothing more than an extraordinary coincidence? Or do they suggest that some people might have abilities to glimpse future events? Please let us know your thoughts in the comment section. And in the meantime, thank you very much for watching.